Hello, glad to see you on my channel. I really value it. And today I want to share with you a wonderful story. It's a dramatic story that will come as a total shock to everybody. It is a really amazing story. So enjoy watching it. Maria woke up at 6 in the morning as usual, and she didn't need an alarm clock all year round. She was used to getting up like that in high school, when she had to do a lot of things before going to school. Mommy then was quite bad already, almost did not get up, and to do things, especially when you live in a room in a communal apartment. It was necessary. In the morning, if it was scheduled, Maria washed the corridor, the bathroom, the kitchen floor in general, all common area. And on Saturdays and Sundays you could find grandmothers, one of whom Maria bought goat's milk and sometimes cottage cheese and sour cream from a cow. She knew that all this is very good for health and was able to persuade Mommy to eat at least a little, drink at least a drop. Maria could also start washing their clothes with her mother in the morning. But most importantly, in the mornings, Maria would prepare lunch and leave it in the refrigerator until she returned from school. There was no time to stand at the stove after her. She had to run to work. Serious business, a schoolgirl of course, could not be entrusted. But one distant acquaintance had mercy and allowed to stand, to trade in the market from the container of women's underwear. Maria woke up as always at 6 in the morning, and she didn't need an alarm clock all year round. She was used to getting up like that back in high school, when she had to do a lot of things before going to school. Mommy then was quite bad already, almost did not get up, and to do things, especially when you live in a room in a communal apartment. It was necessary. In the morning, if it was scheduled, Maria washed the corridor, the bathroom, the kitchen floor in general, all common area. If there was a weekend, necessarily ran to the corner of the street, where she dived on Saturdays and Sundays could find grandmothers, one of whom Maria bought goat's milk, and sometimes cottage cheese and sour cream from a cow. She knew that all this was very good for health, and was able to persuade my mother to eat at least a little, drink at least a drop. Maria could also start washing their clothes with her mother in the morning. But most importantly, in the mornings, Maria would prepare lunch and leave it in the refrigerator until she returned from school. There was no time to stand at the stove after her. She had to run to work. A schoolgirl, of course, could not be entrusted with serious business, but one distant acquaintance had mercy and allowed her to stand, to trade at the market from a container of women's underwear. Daughter, you need to finish 11 grades to enter the institute. Mom said almost every time Maria returned from work. I'll finish, Mommy, she answered, no matter how tired she was, with an unchanging smile. And I'll get in and become a doctor. You'll have your own personal doctor. Mom smiled. But Maria read in her eyes that she did not believe that she would live to see that time. And Maria herself realized that most likely it would happen. Maria's graduation was not a cancer finished its black deed, and on the day when other guys were dancing and dreaming of a happy adult life, Maria saw her parent off on her last journey, and waking up the next morning felt so immensely lonely that it seemed like here, now the heart will stop. It just won't hold out. But it did. The psyche of the young body was still floundering, did not allow so simply to fade away, to go blind and do nothing. Maria rose because her mother would have wanted her to be strong, to study, to continue to live no matter what. They had no relatives, none at all. Because Mom came out of the orphanage and Maria's father, well, from a biological point of view, existed once. But then, Mom only explained once. He loved vodka to death, and Maria never asked any more questions. Having formalized his inheritance of the room, the girl tried the next year to enter the medical school, but failed the entrance exams. Just a little bit short. It was like some bad omen. Maria did not find a place to go out. It turns out that her mother's dream is not destined to come true. But then one girl, with whom we tried to enter together, and she, by the way, past suggested that you go Maria on the nurse. There will be a job and experience and benefit to people, and then, a little later, you will enter. Why waste time? After thinking about it, Maria agreed. And somehow it turned out that she worked as a nurse for 5 years in a very ordinary hospital. She just didn't even try to enroll anymore. Flowed past everyday life, modestly, quietly, without any adventures, passions, big changes. Until one day, everything did not turn upside down. Maria woke up as usual at 6 in the morning. She stretched, squinted at the sun beating through the window, through a gap in the curtains, and threw off the blanket. The coolness embraced the body from the evening, did not close the window, but it cheered up. The girl got up, threw on a robe, slipped her feet into fluffy slippers in the form of rabbit faces, and went to the bathroom. The inhabitants of the communal apartment were asleep. Only Diana, an early bird, was rustling in the kitchen. "Good morning," she said to Marie when she appeared in the kitchen. "Good morning." She smiled back and put the kettle on to heat water for coffee. She didn't feel like having breakfast today, but she wanted coffee with condensed milk. The girl sat down at the table, turned the can over, and a thick, creamy trickle poured into the black drink. Diana shook her head and moved a plate of cheese sandwiches to her. "Thank you, I don't have appetite." "You don't, but he does." Diana nodded at the girl's stomach. Maria's cheeks flooded with color, and it would seem that it would be time to get used to her position and to the fact that it became noticeable to others by one rounded part of the body. But so it was wrong. In her life it should not have happened at all, but one day it did. "Oh, sweetie," Diana said, and went back to her tea, palm up to her cheek. "Life, it's a complicated thing. Anything can turn. But our duty is, you know what it is," smiled the neighbor, "to meet its blows with a raised visor and an open heart. Come on, eat, eat, eat." Maria obediently chewed the sandwich. So and had breakfast in silence. Diana was 80, 2 years old, and in her youth she was. Maria saw her pictures wonderfully good, a thin, bright beauty, a kind of young dew. She was a poetess, a sportswoman, a Komsomol member. But all prospects were ruined by an inappropriate affair with a big man, who turned out to be married, and insisted that Diana got rid of one little problem. After that, she could never have children. But she did marry a widower with 3 sons. Then her husband, who was also her best friend, died, and the children arranged it so that Diana wrote off her inheritance to them and moved into a room in a communal apartment, which they bought for her. Here she lived, as she said herself, soaring in memories and despising the vanity of the present. However, Diana was the only person who, to what happened to Mary, took with understanding, and it all began on what seemed like the most ordinary day. Maria was coming back late from her shift, and as usual she lingered for a moment in the small square near her home. In fact, she had meant to do it in the morning, but had forgotten. So now she poured 2 handfuls of seeds into the bird feeder. Putting her gloves back on, the girl walked along the path. The wind played in the thinning crowns of trees, giving a soothing noise, unfortunately drowned out by the roar of passing cars on the road. The branches of trees swayed, and the light of the nearest lantern in the game of shadows seemed somehow unreal, a little magical. It poured warm yellow stream, so contrasting with the blackness of the wet asphalt. Maria at first took it for a clot of shadows in the bushes of this man, but then, when her vision picked out light spots of the open body, she realized what was the matter. Near the bushes lay on the ground a guy unfamiliar to her, and he was dressed, just in family shorts and a t-shirt. Jeans, boots, and outerwear were not even nearby. Maria grimaced. You'd have to be so drunk. But a sense of mercy, compassion, didn't let her pass by. It's night. The first frosts of fall will hit. The girl approached him, squatted down. "Man," she called out, poking her fingers into his shoulder. "Man, are you sick? Are you drunk?" She sniffed the odor of booze. No. In general, this man didn't seem like a bum to her for some reason. Not that she'd seen so many bums in her life. But yes, working in a hospital, she had already made up for herself some portrait of these personalities. The stranger, in an obviously poor condition, meanwhile moved, groaned, and opened his eyes. "What did you take?" "I'll call an ambulance." "Nothing." With difficulty, he loosened his lips. "I didn't take anything. I don't drink at all." She hummed, rummaging through her purse. "My head hurts. I don't. I don't remember." "What?" "I was stripped. I remember that." He sat up, ridiculously long, skinny arms and legs, wavy long black hair. "What's your name?" asked Maria, who was beginning to think that this guy was a bit of a mess, in the sense that he wasn't just a homeless guy or a lowlife. "Where do you live?" "Tony, I think. I don't remember." He tilted his head back from behind the park thicket and looked out the glowing windows of a 9-story paneled building. "Not here." "I have 3 floors in my house." "I see," sighed Maria. "I was going somewhere, and then I fell. And then I was beaten and they took everything off." He spread his hands, and he looked so helpless now, it made Maria's heart ache. "Here's the thing, Tony. You need to go to an orphanage. Charities run shelters for homeless people. In fact, it's probably the place to go if you're in a difficult situation. And you need to see a doctor. In case you don't remember, you probably have a head injury and..." "No, don't go to the shelter. That's bad word," exclaimed the boy, and his face contorted with such horror that Maria almost cried. How on earth had life gotten this poor fellow? "Let's go," she said resolutely, rising. "Where to?" The mysterious Tony rose too. He was visibly shivering, which was not surprising in this weather. "The shelter is on the other side of town," Maria explained. "I don't have the money to pay for a cab. I don't have an advance at work until tomorrow. But the main thing, you need to warm up right now, or you'll catch pneumonia and meningitis." In general, Maria was not sure about the last threat, but it seemed to her that the new acquaintance as a ruffled sparrow, frightened, not ready to move with her, even though he was almost naked and now could faint. So she tried to persuade him in every possible way. "I live here," Maria explained. "I have a communal apartment. Everything is decent. Thank you," the guy replied, and they went on their way. Fortunately, they didn't meet anyone in the entrance. Maria opened the door of the apartment, and Tony, looking around shocked, as if it was the first time he had ever been in an apartment, came in next. "My room." She let him in. "So here." She handed him a bottle of shower gel, handed him a towel and slippers. "Get in the shower, get warm, come out, and I'll give you some tea." And she looked him up and down. "I'll see what I can do with your clothes." "John." Maria knocked on the door at the end of the hallway where one of her neighbors lived. A young boy. "John, are you home?" A moment later, the door opened. "Hi," John smiled. "How's our squirrel doing?" It was his traditional joke address that Maria was used to. They were peers, and he nicknamed her Squirrel for her red hair color. And until she was 14, her front teeth protruded crookedly forward until she got braces. They grew up, in fact, together. So Sergei Maria perceived as if he were a brother. You just rarely see him. The thing was, John used to live here with his grandfather, who taught at the university. But then his grandfather fell in love with his grandmother and moved to her in a remote village on the Volga. John came back here when he was already 18 and entered the university. He decided to become a geologist like his grandfather, and lately he was hardly ever at home on an expedition. But now, fortunately, John was home. You see, such a thing. And Maria, in a couple of phrases, outlined that picked up a man here on the street, and he urgently needs at least pants. and a t-shirt or a shirt and a jacket and sneakers and socks, because he needs something to wear out of the house. Not a problem. John nodded and fixed his glasses that had slipped down his nose. I'll find something. You're lucky, he added from the depths of the room. I'm leaving tomorrow, maybe until spring. He came back with a stack of clothes and shoes. I'll give them to you when I get back. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, John grinned and leaned toward her. Kiss me. Maria laughed and kissed him on the cheek. It was also an old but very rarely practiced joke between them. She could kiss him when he left, when he came back on big holidays. However, never had either of them ever had even the thought of a romantic relationship. Why? If they thought about this question seriously, they could answer that it just happened. No, that was it. They saw each other solely as friends and good neighbors. Maria knocked in the bathroom and handed Tony, who looked out of there for a moment, thanking him for covering himself with a towel, the clothes and socks she had gotten while she put her shoes in her room. While Tony dressed, Maria ran to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. She took the boiling kettle into her room. There were cookies and cheese for tea. There was no butter, though, but that was enough for a snack, I think. And the time was already late. And tomorrow before work, Maria planned to take Tony to some shelter where he would be taken care of. Tony sat down in a chair, one of two in the room. Maria took the other. They drank tea. The boy was no longer shivering and looked thoughtful to the extreme. So, what do you remember? Maria asked. She wasn't an expert in human psychology, but for some reason, it seemed to her that Tony was being honest with her right now. He remembered riding in a car, riding in the company of a woman and some other people. Then a blackout. He woke up at the train station and didn't know what had happened. He only wanted to wander somewhere. He walked until he found himself in that very square, and here strangers came up to him and asked him if he had a phone because they needed to call him. He said he didn't. They didn't believe him and beat him up, took away his clothes. More scraps, Tony frowned. Like images of the past, sun and sea, dark corridors. It's weird, but I feel it's like it physically hurts me to try to remember. Then don't, Maria sighed. It'll sort itself out somehow, or... She was about to add that they'd sort it out tomorrow when he went to the orphanage, but there was a knock at the door. It was John. Politely but insistently, he asked to talk to the mysterious foundling. Maria could understand him after all, a strange man from the street. So you're sleeping at my place, John said firmly. Don't get me wrong. You need somewhere to lay your head. The ladies' room is not an option. I've got a sofa, by the way. Tony nodded gratefully and left. Maria began to get ready for bed. Through the door, she heard a couple of unhappy phrases. The neighbors, the Krushinins, were wondering who John brought to his house. But then, everything was quiet. People were asleep. In the morning, John, going to the station, shared with Tony Reza and still handed the guy 500 rubles. Maria prepared breakfast. Tony only went to the bathroom for 5 minutes, looked into the kitchen, and hid in the room again. He reminded Maria of a frightened animal, cautious and does not understand what is happening and how to live on. However, it seems to be quite natural for a man who lost his memory. Maria really wanted to believe that the guy has a family and that soon will find his relatives. Good morning, mademoiselle, jokingly greeted her Diana, who on this day, which was surprising, got up even earlier than Maria. However, as it turned out, the old lady had a reason. She and other poetry lovers were going to a creative meeting at a club for pensioners, and here she got up in the early morning to learn a poem. Maria apologized to her for her guest, but Diana shook her head and said that kindness and helpfulness are the most natural human qualities, so there is nothing to be ashamed of. And you know, sweetheart, the old woman added thoughtfully, I haven't met such a correct Italian accent for a long time. What? Maria didn't understand that Tony. Diana smiled. Didn't you notice? He said hello to me. We had a few words. He has a slight accent. But believe a man who knew a lot of Italians in his time, such an accent can only have someone who has lived in Italy for a long time. Somewhere closer to Sicily, yes, that's the most. I don't know, Maria sighed. He doesn't look like an Italian, except in appearance. Oh, I'll shut up, Diana smiled. So the old woman's chatter, do not pay attention. Marie had never encountered a homeless shelter in reality before. She called one, and they told her that in principle, they would accept. But right now, they have a quarantine. One of the residents is sick with measles. A call to the other one scared her because they said they would accept the poor guy, but not for free, and for free, everything is full. And then they very carefully began to ask if he was all alone, and they added that they would take Tony for free. But he would have to go to another city. No, they wouldn't tell the exact address, because then it wouldn't be her concern. What is it? She was so busy with the calls, she was late for work. Come on, she said to Tony. I have an idea. The hospital where Maria worked had a large park on its grounds, but it was in a state of disrepair. But recently, it had been renovated. Ideally, it should have been resolved with the top management, but Maria went directly to Michael. Michael served at the hospital for 35 years and was something like a senior janitor, salvosa, plumber, electrician, gardener, watchman. In general, he was the jack of all trades. Michael lived in an apartment in an almost emergency building, but almost not round the clock spent here at the hospital with him, and talked about his new acquaintance, Maria. Well, if the guy is smart, then it means that as soon as he restores the documents, it will be possible to put him in our service somehow. Or maybe he will work at the substation. And also, you know, I have connections at the city dump, continued Mikhailch importantly. Let's bring the boy here. Leaving Tony to Michael, Maria rushed to the hospital. She already knew that she will be reprimanded by the head nurse. The day at work flew by quickly and hectic. It turned out that one nurse was not on duty, and the second nurse broke something and hurt herself badly, so Maria had an additional load. And then, near the end of the shift, Maria went out to the yard to check on Tony. Well, what can I say? Michael told her in confidence. Your bum is, Michael waved his hand. I'll tell you this. I knew all sorts of scientists, academicians, and I'll tell you, he's smarter than theirs. I talked to him about daisies, and he gave me, a whole lecture. He spoke Latin, talked about varieties, then about pine trees. In general, maybe he was a botanist, a student. Michael scratched the back of his head. Then, at lunchtime, I took him to my place. Well, in the gatehouse, so to speak. Maria nodded. She knew that in the room where Michael was supposed to store all the household stuff, he had equipped a corner for rest with something like a bedstead and a stoop table. And I told him about our art gallery. Well, for me as a pensioner, visiting it is cheap, so I said that I go there. So he understands it, and in art. Michael waved his hand again. Maybe you have this millionaire or the son of a millionaire who lost his memory. Very smart and intelligent, says that in London. In the museum, when he saw a painting. Okay, Maria interrupted hastily, and not particularly polite, as if to emphasize the conversation for today is over. We'll go now, okay? Okay, Michael nodded. You bring him. If anything, he's a smart guy. And when you decide where to live, so I can help you. I have acquaintances can rent a corner to a decent man. They returned home in silence. Maria felt disgusted. First of all, today she was very busy at work and did not take Tony to the shelter. But she should have. He seemed helpless, somehow frightened. It seemed impossible to say to him, "You're a grown-up guy. Yes, you had a misfortune in your life and I did not throw you naked on the street at night. I took you in. But you can deal with it yourself. Go to the shelter. Restore your documents. Get a job. Remember, get treatment. Live. I'm not your babysitter. And the problem was that it was a babysitter for Tony, now Maria felt herself. Who is he? Accent knowledge. Education, as if there is. But what kind of man is he? And why is he attached to her like a stray dog? We walked back in silence. Maria only asked if he remembered anything. Tony replied that scraps come and that's all. And she awkwardly joked that maybe he should be advertised in England, if he remembered that he was there in some museum. For some reason, Tony was offended by the harmless joke. On the way back, Maria went to the store to restock the fridge, especially since it was necessary to feed not only herself, but also a grown man. The communal apartment met with unusual silence. It turned out that some neighbors the family had gone to the village to visit relatives and even about it, notifying, so to speak, other inhabitants of the communal apartment, left a note in the corridor on the wall. The neighbor, geologist, had also left on his own business. And only from the room where Diana lived came the quiet whispering of the TV. Maria put tea on and quickly prepared dinner. She tried to give Tony such a task as peeling potatoes, but the guy almost cut off his fingers on the first root vegetable, so she just put him on a stool and told him to wait for dinner. Maria thought about it, and it turned out that this time the guy had to spend the night at her place, because the friendly neighbor, of course, locked his room before leaving. But she wasn't frightened by the co-sleeping overnight. She treated Tony in general now, extremely calmly. It was just as natural as breathing to know that he wouldn't hurt her. Yeah, the guy's weird. At first glance, you might even think he's stupid. But then it turns out that he is smart, well-read, well-mannered. Just shocked to the extreme by what happened to him, by the fact that he lost his memory. Anybody would be weird. Thank you, Tony said as they entered her room. You're welcome, said Maria, who was already pulling an extra set of linens out of the closet to put her unfortunate guest on the floor. No, I really appreciate it. Tony, standing at the window, watched the ribbon of cars creeping down the road. When I find out who I am and find, I somehow think I'm bound to have one. I won't forget you. You've become close to me. They were simple, ingenuous words, and actually Tony had thanked her before, more than once. But for some reason, they touched Maria so much that she froze at the closet. She suddenly felt her loneliness more acutely than ever before. Yeah, she was treated well by Diana and John, and there were co-workers she was buddies and friends with, but essentially, she was alone. She was used to being alone since her mother's death, and while she was alive. Maria suddenly realized more acutely than ever that she had never really thought about her future. To marry, to have children. It was so ordinary and natural for millions of people, perceived by them perhaps as an obligatory program of life on Earth. But why did she avoid such plans? Why did she live like in a dream all these years? What was wrong with her? It was a shock, a kind of catharsis. And right now, Maria suddenly realized that she was saying all this out loud, pouring out her soul in front of Tony. He was suddenly so close that she could feel his hot breath on the back of her neck. His strong palms gently, shelteringly descended on her palms. And he said something that made Maria completely lose herself. He said simply, "I'm with you. Don't be afraid. I won't leave you." And then she, turning around, suddenly ran into his lips. No, after a moment she realized, she first reached out to kiss him. And it was the first, awkward, and yet filled with some primal longing. "Please," she whispered as their lips parted so they could get a breath of air. "Please." Her hands roamed over his body in a frantic need to get even closer, and as if simultaneously terrified that he would pull away and say they were making some kind of mistake. If Maria were told now that a meteorite would fall on her in the next instant for what she wanted, she would not hesitate to say, "So be it. Just may I pray you." May the moment be prolonged a little longer. He didn't push her away. He hugged her back. He did not say that neither made a mistake. He only pressed closer and then, in the oblivion of love, whispered words in some other incomprehensible to her. The coming morning was like a firework of sunlight beating through the windows, bird trills coming in through the open window and the cold air entering the room through it. Maria jumped out of bed to close the windows and then turned around, and everything that happened was covered by a tsunami. The girl pressed her palm to her mouth. Came panic and comprehension. What had she done? But then the answer came. What had happened? She's an adult, a grown-up and independent woman. And she's just had an intimacy with a man. It's a life situation, you know. Only Maria had not planned anything like that until she gave in to this obsession. And she had not even drunk anything harmful the day before, which could theoretically prompt such a madness, except for tea with sugar. But it's hardly anything to do with it, is it? So she did it all herself, going off to Tony. Who does that make her? The guy. What if I thought he's got a lover out there in real life, outside of amnesia, maybe even a young wife and kids? Oh, what had she done? Early morning was slowly but inexorably moving towards the day and the awakening of the lover, the inevitable conversations about what had happened. All this was. Maria understood necessarily these conversations will be, and what to say to her. I'm sorry, it happened, accidentally. But you forget, because I do not love you, and in general. Go, dear, in the shelter. Good morning, said an awakened Tony and smiled. Please don't say anything. Maria, who had already pulled on some clothes, threw her closet at the boy. Tony looked suspiciously, but then, cheeks flushed, nodded. Silently he got dressed. Then, just as silently, they tidied themselves up and sat down in the kitchen to eat breakfast. However, said Maria asked if he would have scrambled eggs, and also clarified that she agreed that today Tony can be determined in the hospital, because he has amnesia, and this is still serious. And I'll also contact the volunteers, and they'll help look for your relatives, Maria said, and smiled awkwardly. She got up from the table to put the dirty dishes in the sink, but did not make a step. He caught her arm. We need to talk, Tony said seriously. Don't, the girl cut him off with a pleading tone. What we had between us. I was wrong, Maria blurted out, and roughly pulled her hand out, shook off his fingers as if they were burning, hurting. But, please, I really don't want to talk about it. Let's not make this harder than it has to be, she sighed. I don't think I need to go to the hospital. As if obediently agreeing to take the topic in a different direction altogether. Tony agreed. Sometimes amnesia can be caused by serious illness or trauma. We need to understand what's wrong with you, Maria said patiently. And what am I supposed to say there? The same thing And for volunteers in general, it's best to give as many details as you can. Anything you can remember at all. It will probably help. Don't worry, she tried to smile. It took them in a good mood, that everything will be all right. But she realized that after what had happened last night, she was not very good at it. You will be in the same hospital where I work. I will visit you, and not once a day. Maybe not today? Why? Tony shrugged and stared at his hands clasped together and lying on the table. Just, understand, it's not really convenient for you to stay here. I have neighbors. It's a communal apartment. I see. Tony nodded. And there was something not so good in his voice, as if he had already decided for himself how things really were, and there was no way to change his mind. I'd better not stay here anymore. I get. What do you understand? Maria burst into flames after him, and with him. I only know that what happened between us. It was real. He was beside her again and looked down at her. He was much taller. It wasn't a dream, Maria grinned. But that, That doesn't mean anything. Why? Is there someone else? What's that got to do with it? What does it matter? No, I don't have someone, but it's just... The girl fluttered her arms helplessly. She just didn't know how to explain that she hadn't planned to give herself to a stranger practically. That it had come out spontaneously, and now she was completely confused. I'll probably wait downstairs, Tony said. I'll sit on the bench. The weather's nice. I'll think. Maybe I'll remember something. Maria turned her back to the sink and said nothing. She turned on the water, started the dishes, and heard the front door slam. Tony going outside and really sat down on a bench. The guy felt even worse than when he woke up on the street. Now he had an added problem in his life. What an idiot, asshole. A canine. He blamed himself for the fact that, like some animal, he had given in to the impulse and responded to the caress of this sweet, kind, pure, and bright girl. He should have stopped at a kiss. It was felt that Maria was completely inexperienced, that she did not know what she was doing. She gave in to her emotions, innocent and vicious at the same time. She was looking for warmth, love. It was so natural, except that he's not the right person for it. If only because he doesn't understand who he is. Maybe he's already married, and there's a house and a family, and a family, and a family of 7. And in general, Tony did not know exactly what moral qualities he was a man in his former life before amnesia, but somehow it seemed to him that among them there was no such thing as dragging into bed unfamiliar girls who clearly can then regret their impulsiveness. Thinking about all this, the guy watched the sparrows flitting in a puddle, warmed by the meager sun. He somehow did not pay much attention to the car slowed down nearby. It's him! Only when he heard the words, he turned around, frowned, looking at the faces of the people approaching him. 2 of them were unfamiliar, just some jocks in black business suits and serious faces, as if they were going to a funeral, some headphones in their ears. But the 3rd man was as if familiar, and this recognition was like a blow to the mind. His head spun. Tony opened his mouth to say something very important to this man. He had already risen from the bench, stepped forward. Having finished the dishes, Maria put on her coat, put on her shoes, checked the contents of her purse. Then she lingered at the mirror, made a couple of strokes with a brush of mascara, and finally left the apartment. She went downstairs and turned her head, looking for Tony. "Tony!" she called out, looking around. But the guy was nowhere to be found. He'd just disappeared. 6 months had passed since Tony's disappearance, and Maria's world was turned upside down again. And later, looking back, she was amazed at how easily she'd accepted that Tony was gone. And the fact that he'd left, deciding that he had enough of all this, Maria did not doubt that. And she blamed herself and what fool wanted. Picked up some tramp, brought to himself, fed and fed, gave him clothes, cared for his health, and whether he really had amnesia. Or was it such an original way to favor himself, to force to help through the quality of any good man pity? Tony had disappeared so cleverly just before he could have gone to a hospital where he would have been helped. Tony had disappeared so conveniently just after they had become unbearably close, thus avoiding all unnecessary questions and claims on her part. Although, thought Maria, heaven knows, she would not have demanded anything from him. After all, in what had happened, beyond any doubt, was only her stupid female guilt of loneliness. She did not try to look for him. That is, at first, she rushed down the street one way, shouting, "Tony, Tony," but then she came back to the bench and sat there for a while, looking at the sparrows brushing their feathers in the puddle, and accepting as a fact that she was, in fact, just taken advantage of in every sense. And there was no one to blame but herself. And then she just went to work. And the day went quite as usual, not counting, of course, reprimanded for lateness and a question from Michael how to say, "There, Andrew." "Normal, I guess," said Maria. He left. On all 4 sides, and that was the end of all explanations. Finally, Maria and Diana finished their breakfast. "I'm gonna go, dear." The neighbor smiled at her. "You're going to the clinic, right?" Maria asked, and after waiting for an answer offered, "If you want, I'll walk you." "No need," Diana shook her head. "There's no need to bother with me. An old woman or I'll get lazy. It's not far. I'll walk slowly." "Well, as you wish," sighed Maria. After the neighbor left, she looked at her watch, and it was time to go to work. Lately, Maria reminded herself more and more of a clumsy, fat duck walking was uncomfortable and heavy. Now and then had to give herself a break, and the girl thought with horror about what will happen to her at the end of the term. But if she suddenly appeared to her some magical executor of desires and offered a choice of physical inconvenience of pregnancy or annoying attention of others, she would certainly prefer to put up with the first and get rid of the second. The thing was that recently all in a row poked their noses into the Carr personal life. At work, they wondered who the father was. She didn't seem to be seeing anyone. Didn't say. And there were rumors, that and married he, and there was a casual connection in the club. One Michael tactfully kept silent, but it seems most of all guessed about the true culprit of Maria's situation. But in his home communal room, everyone knew everything. And it was just terrible. Even John, so tactful, showed himself not on the best side. In general, when he was on his business trips, he usually wrote texts. But here he called and told off Maria, as if she was his little sister. And what was especially embarrassing, he asked 100 times, and whether it was exactly this connection voluntary. Mary answered that yes, and in fact she added with tears she had started it first. Then John said that in principle it was terrible but not fatal, and she, since she had missed the deadline practically and decided to leave, she should be careful and really take care of herself. Maria herself knew it very well. But the neighbors and the person of the family were not so delicate. The head of it, Jimmy, so just more than once joked rudely about the fact that here what turned out to be in a quiet pool of water. And it seemed that Mary modest, "It's a pity, with a potbelly you," he once said. When he came home once again drunk, and his wife was absent, was at a parent teacher conference at school. Otherwise, I would offer you to have fun. Jimmy grinned and winked at Maria with a black eye. He, after receiving his salary, went at least a week drunk and with signs of fighting with neighbors from several other apartments, from whom a fat piece of this very salary drunk. "You're not picky," Jimmy finished in a low voice. That's what loneliness does to a woman, already on the homeless throwing. And why, when there are men cleaner, more decent? Maria was afraid for herself, but then Jimmy's wife came back. Maria decided for herself that she would now be more careful. Too closely now on her now squinted Jimmy. For you could even think, though it was sickening from this, that he is attracted to women in a position. That day, after a joint breakfast with Diana, Maria was about to leave the kitchen and go to work to get ready, as Krichin Jimmy suddenly came in, or rather fell in. "Oh, hello," he smiled in a rugged smile. Maria remembered that today his wife had taken their children, all three of them, for a walk in the park. Diana had gone to the clinic. John was on his expedition. So it was that unfortunate moment again when she was alone with a neighbor with cloudy, greasy eyes. So it is necessary now just to leave as carefully as possible, in the corridor and outside, to work. And in the evening, there will be other people in the communal room again, and it'll be a little more peaceful. "Good morning," Maria said, and stepped back to the window because the neighbor was approaching. Probably, she thought, he needed something in the kitchen cupboard. But no, his hands with yellowed fingernails plopped onto the windowsill, and Jimmy basically cornered Maria. "Oh, come on, don't break down. I know what kind of women you are when you're fat, horny. I do not understand." "What are you talking about?" mumbled Maria, and turned her face away from the stinking jet of booze. And so it happened that accidentally looking out the window she caught a glimpse of a strange picture to their house, drove up a motorcade of jeeps, and the head car stopped in front of their driveway. "Two pickles, I say," grinned the neighbor and licked his weathered lips. "And you know what else?" "I don't understand," Maria repeated, and grabbed the wrist of the hand that had reached for her. She couldn't let this abomination touch her belly, but her neighbor's other hand was free, and he reached out with it. Maria felt nauseous. Fear flooded her. She wanted to scream, to break free, to run away. "You're young, you're juicy," Jimmy whispered, his eyes spinning drunkenly. "I won't hurt." Marie thought she was in a nightmare, but she was suddenly jerked out of it by the ringing of the doorbell. Jimmy jerked, somehow all hunched over and almost hissed aloud, backed away from Maria, threw at her sticky, prickly look at her mold. "Do not talk about what was between us." Maria rushed into the corridor as if her life depended on it. Surely, she thought, it was Diana who had come back and forgotten something at home, or a notice from the post office. Even if the debt collectors showed up for the debt she couldn't pay. Let them. Anything was better than being here alone with Jimmy. Maria opened the door and froze, because there was Tony standing on the doorstep. And yet it was a completely different person. Her Tony was hunched over like an insecure young boy. This one stood with his shoulders squared and his chin up proudly. This man had a short beard and mustache that made him look like an Italian mobster from some movie. He was dressed not in tatters, not in off, the shoulder clothes, but in a well-fitting dark blue pinstripe business suit, a snow, white shirt and a tie the shade of blueberries. Tony looked at her sensitively, questioningly, gently, openly. In his eyes there was steel, threat, aggression, mockery, and power. Power. "Tony?" said Maria, a colorless voice. She asked, but she could have sworn on anything that despite the striking resemblance, the man in front of her was different. And she wasn't wrong. "No," the man across the threshold was squinting dangerously. "So that's who my idiot brother had knocked up." "What?" Maria recoiled. She was frightened and insulted at the same time. Too many dirty jokes had been poured on her these days. Too many people asking her how come she missed the deadline when she could have gotten rid of her little problem. Too many people were scornfully and even gloatingly predicting her fate as a destitute single mother. "I don't understand." "What right do you have?" She didn't have time to finish because he grabbed her arm, clamped his claw around the woman's fragile wrist and pulled her to him. "You think you're the only smart one? You think you'll get it? Although you've actually managed to go a lot farther than the others?" "What? What the hell are you doing? What's going on? I didn't mean to get anyone. And who are you?" "My name's Marky. I'm Tony's brother. And you're..." Maria rounded her eyes and almost yelled, "What the hell is going on here? What millionaire?" "But you won't get away with it," Mark smiled or grinned. "Guys, it's as agreed." Maria only now noticed that there, behind the back of the angry copy of Tony, and on the platform, stood a few more men, the type of appearance of which would allow them to pass without any trial for the role of bad guys in a Hollywood action movie. And now, 3 of these types, without any invitations, broke into the communal apartment and then into Maria's room. "Who are you here to see?" A drunken Jimmy peeked out of the kitchen. "For debts, or what?" Shutting his mouth, Mark growled. "I see." Jimmy drunkenly hiccuped and disappeared into the kitchen and shut the door behind him for good measure. "What do you allow yourself?" "Let go." In Maria's mind, 2 desires were beating in panic, to resist desperately what was happening and at the same time to behave quietly, like a mouse, in the naive, silly hope that everything might still be fine. "You're coming with us," Mark said sternly. Meanwhile, his men had returned from Maria's room, and the girl realized that they seemed to be going through her things. "Nothing, boss," said one of them. "What were you looking for? And put that down now." I don't know nothing about your Tony. He's gone. And I'm not going anywhere with you. You will, Mark said, and then suddenly he just picked the girl up in his arms, and she just shrieked and floundered. It was scary to be in the arms of this giant. But Maria also recognized him holding her gently and cozily. How cozy can a pregnant woman be in such a position? Now, put it down, me, on the ground, Maria said sternly. Sometimes she thought about her work, and time after time she came to the conclusion that in addition to unconditional help to people, she found another useful thing. Maria learned to communicate with a variety of different, including not quite adequate people. Alcoholics alone were worth it, and she had once worked in the toxicology department, and now this skill was being tested live on some obscure type like Tony's brother, who was no more similar to her Tony than earth is similar to air, and light to darkness. I don't know what happened in there, Maria added, when she was actually brought back to an upright position on her own feet. But I wasn't trying to get him or get him into the registry office with his belly button. I just helped him out when he, for I don't know what reason, ended up on the street with no memory and what? The man's anti-mirror reflection of Tony had his eyebrows drawn together. What do you mean, no memory? He has amnesia, explained Maria, who understood less and less by the minute. Why, when he came back to you, he already remembered everything. My brother, Tony the man, was now looking at her strangely. He's in a coma. He's in a coma now. And when he disappeared, he ran away. And then when he was found, he didn't have any amnesia. I don't understand. Marie felt like the room was running out of air, and she was so afraid for Tony. What happened to him? How did he get into a coma? I don't know, his brother answered, and his face lost all its sternness in an instant, and now he looked like a boy, shocked and dismayed by the trouble that had befallen his own man. Tony left one day. We had a fight. Tony had a fight with his whole family. I looked for him. We looked for him. We found him. And then he got hurt and went into a coma. He fell, and I found out that the girl he was having an affair with, that she was pregnant. So I decided to find out what was going on. You have to fall hard to have a coma, Maria said. He fell down the stairs. Mark rubbed the bridge of his nose and sighed noisily. I don't understand at all what happened. I think my brother went crazy. I'm going to go crazy too, said Maria, who wanted to wake up now. And when she woke up, all that had happened was a dream, preferably without knowing Mark or his brother. Ah, yes. And I would like not to be pregnant as a nice bonus to return to my normal past life. Can we talk in peace? Mark stretched out almost pitifully. I guess I was misinformed. I thought you were having an affair. But I didn't know anything at all about his amnesia. I was told they'd just found him. You know, Maria grinned bitterly, for a man of your status, you have very strange and deceitful informants. Where did you hire private detectives or whoever else you hired in a subway passage? I apologize. Mark spread his hands. You don't look like Tony at all. Maria nervously blew her bangs off her forehead, a habit she had when she was nervous, instead of taking a couple of invisibles and tidying up her disheveled hair. You broke into my apartment. You demanded that I go somewhere with you. You claimed that I was having an affair with your brother, and all I did was pick him up on the street when he was naked and beaten. I never intended to have an affair with him. It didn't work out the way I wanted it to. No. She raised her hand, wiped her tears away with a sob. I don't mean to say that your brother forced me to do anything. Not at all. Oh, what kind of day is this? We just spent the night, and then the next morning he was gone. Once again, I apologize, Mark growled with a frustrated bear. It turns out that things are not at all what I think they are. Beg you, let's talk calmly about everything, shall we? If it's convenient for you, he glanced at the kitchen, where Jimmy Crucina's silhouette was still darkening. We can do it not here, but you know what, sighed Maria, who finally stopped feeling like a splinter in a raging sea. I have to go to work, to the hospital. People are waiting there, and the bosses, you know, they don't like lazy nurses. And your important conversations can wait. Yes, I'm sorry that Tony is in a coma, but something tells me that you have money and the best specialists are taking care of him now, so I don't think my talking to you is going to make any difference at all. You seem to care more about my unborn child than anything else. Well, for the sake of him, and myself for his mother, not to be unemployed, fired for absenteeism, I'm going to work now. I'm working a shift. It ends at 9 o'clock. And then, if you need it so much, okay, we can talk. With these words, Maria picked up her coat and purse, got dressed, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and looked Mark in the eyes again. And by the way, no matter how much you apologize, you can't fix your first impressions of yourself, no matter how hard you try. You seem to be used to solving everything by brute force. And if you want me to talk to you at all, and not to write a statement about what you've done here, then please think about how we will communicate further, and don't repeat the past mistakes. Now, let me through. Mark took a step back over the threshold. His henchman, as Maria called his escort, also retreated. The girl walked to the elevator, summoned it, and rode down. How fed up she was with everything, and how unsettling, because it was as if here intuition had woken up and was telling her that something bad had really happened to Tony, something worse than a coma. And actually, she should be completely indifferent to him because they'd just spent the night together, except that was impossible, because she had already, to her own misfortune and confusion, started to feel something for this guy. And now Maria could have sworn that something complicated, incomprehensible, and frightening for her was just beginning. Mark saw the girl off with a thoughtful look. Then there was a low rumbling sound as the man growled in fury. He snatched up the phone, dialed the number. Cretins. What am I paying money for, huh? I'm your agency in a brick. What a fare. That girl just saved him. My brother had amnesia. How hard was it to find out? What the hell did you sell me? What did I pay you 500 grand for? What? Your people made a little mistake. This is the best detective agency in the city. I don't need your services anymore. And I swear to you, all your clients past, present, and future will know about your lousy work. That's it. I've said it all. Finished talking, Mark put the phone in his jacket pocket and nervously smoothed his hair, which had been neatly styled earlier in the morning, but which had been mussed by the wind later. He sniffed and squeaked squeamishly from the neighboring apartment, even with the doors closed, smelled of sauerkraut and animal urine. The grandmother, a dandelion on a small pension, denying herself everything, managed to keep a few stray dogs, which were not particularly trained to ask for their business on the street, and even if they were trained poor Preskovia, simply did not have the strength to walk with them. What do we do, boss? One of the guys approached Mark. Call me to another normal agency, he muttered back. I want to know everything about this girl in an hour tops. Now, let's go. What a stench. How does she live here? But the main question that tormented Mark was why his brother had lost his memory and why he only found out about it now. Maria had once read about such a mole. In extreme or just very difficult life situations, a person turns on something like a self-preservation system to ensure that the psyche does not finally break down. And probably, she thought, it was she who had such a fuse and triggered it. Because how else could it be explained that she spent her working day immersed in practical concerns, thinking about patients, about what to do, but not about Tony and his brother. But when the shift came to an end, she was, as they call it, overwhelmed. Maria, are you ill? Asked Catherine, a colleague and part-time best friend since medical school. No, I'm fine. Maria smiled faintly, but a moment later she was already sniffing her nose because, well, there would be someone to lie to. Anyone but Catherine. The girls sat down in the nursing room and Maria, a little confused, but still clearly told about everything that had happened to her in the morning. And the backstory, by the way, was Catherine generally known in all details, being, as they say, atoms decomposed. Except that at the time of all this backstory, Catherine was not in the city, was visiting her parents in the village. The problems there were Big Father. Auto mechanic hand hurt, repairing the tractor, and Maria just did not want to load Catherine more. And their troubles. And then, when told everything, that in Devasochok immediately dumped that is the news of her pregnancy. And it was Catherine, in fact, helped her to reconcile with the idea that it was necessary. Of course, earlier to worry and do not think that it is just a cycle, disrupted. But now, since it's too late, it's only left to accept and love this baby with all your heart. You still wanted to have children one day, said Catherine, but not in the same conditions, divorced Maria. What will I give him or her? And then I thought that someone, but you in all these fables about the fact that the child somehow by itself will find money, do not believe. You're right, Catherine said sternly. Children are a huge responsibility, difficulties, and expenses. But I also know that right now you are contraindicated to sour. You have to hold on and live well no matter what, you know. It's impossible. And now Catherine for the second time sat next to her best friend, held her hand, and listened attentively. No, alone I will not let you go, she said resolutely. He left you his phone, this guy. No, Maria suddenly realized in surprise. Do you think he'll be waiting under the door for me to come back? With it will become from the way you described him, Catherine wrinkled her nose. Toxic man, nothing to say. But we will cope with it, friend. So I'm also leaving. The shift is over, but I thought you were going to the gym to yoga. Still will not relax until I do not figure out what's going on with you, waved Catherine. Come on, maybe no one and you are not guarding. It turned out that indeed Mark did not guard Maria at her apartment, because his spectacular motorcade of jeeps parked near the hospital. Don't get in the car, Catherine instructed. We communicate in a crowded place. You say so? As if he is a maniac. And who knows? Squinted friend. Catherine was perky, a little distrustful of the world girl. 4 brothers older and 2 younger than her, and her mother, father, and paralyzed grandmother, plus quite a vigorous great-grandmother. That's who lived in her rural, ancestral home. However, 2 of her older brothers, like her, were there only occasionally. One was working as a shift worker in Kamchatka, the other as a welder on construction sites. So, and kept the family. Catherine went to the dictates of the soul simply from childhood, wanted to treat people, and why not a nurse? Not everyone becomes academicians. Luminaries of medicine in everyday life hospitals and others. There are important people without whom you cannot do without, whom you cannot do without. And also on weekends in the warm season, and especially in his vacation, Catherine devoted herself to her favorite hobby of growing flowers and quietly dreamed that one day, even if already to retirement, she will be able to breed a new variety of roses, which will be able to breed a new variety of roses, which will be admired by the whole world. Maria. From the blackhead Jeep motorcade came out Mark and approached the girls. In his hands a bouquet of flowers, expensive to look at and obscenely lush. I apologize again for this morning. Instead of apologizing, let's have a better explanation. Catherine stepped forward, literally overshadowing her friend, and even the bouquet of flowers intended for her intercepted with a look absolutely indifferent to such beauty. Maria is my best friend. We are like sisters, and I will not allow anyone to get on her nerves, fool her head, especially now when she is in such a position. So if you want to talk, then talk, But only, let's be honest and to the point. Maria opened her mouth. For some reason she thought that Mark would go crazy for such a thing, but he froze for a moment, as if he was assessing the situation and like a hunting dog deciding who it was in front of him. And then he nodded and agreed, and offered to talk in a more convenient place than on the street, namely in the nearest cafe. Okay, answered. A little thought Catherine, and the look she had was so businesslike and serious that Maria even became funny, can be thought. They are with her so important and busy persons. But you pay, added Catherine and Maria Agnulu. Somehow uncomfortable, it turned out, however, having a head. She immediately coughed because her friend, covering the unfortunate bouquet, quite sensitively elbowed her in the side of the silence. Say, Mark nodded, told his men to stay in their cars, and the trio headed for the cafe. The small company settled down at the far table by the window Catherine chose. The waitress brought the menu, and again Catherine ordered herself and her friend a large coffee glassy. Mark took a plain black coffee, and then he warned that he would have to start from afar and spoke. It turned out that the family of Mark and Tony, namely their great-grandparents, had long ago moved to Italy because they had noble roots, and also because the great-grandfather was a merchant, and also because the great-grandfather was a merchant and, accordingly, could not continue to lead the same way of life under the new Soviet regime. In Italy, of course, the first time was also very difficult, but business savvy and open temperament soon allowed us to get used to it, and they settled where their fellow countrymen lived. And already there, in Sicily, grandmother Elizabeth was born. She married Antonio, the son of a respectable man, the owner of many vineyards, and from that moment everyone began to believe that the family stones finally settled in the new land. In marriage with Antonio, Elizabeth had 3 children, Cesare, Veronica, and Alexander, names for the 2 heirs, by the way, chosen by great-grandparents. Alexander, unlike his other relatives, and the family, by the way, has become by that time very numerous, which, however, for Sicily was not surprising. Alexander decided to leave the farming and devote himself to the arts. This decision was not taken in a flurry, and even helped the eldest of the heirs of the family to enter the prestigious university in Rome. It was assumed that Alexander will become a scientist, but he, having acquired a sea of relevant knowledge, decided to engage in trade in antiques, and was in this so successful that solidly increased the family fortune. And then Alexander fell in love, and here, by the way, went against the opinion of his family, which had already picked up his bride girl from a noble family in Sicily, which was to become his good wife and a wonderful mistress of his home. But Alexander was stubborn as 1,000 donkeys and said that he can even completely deny it. But he will marry Selina, beauty model, with whom he met at a party in Rome. The family accepted the condition, and at the wedding, none of the relatives did not show up. Moreover, the father and other relatives carried out a threat on their part and denied the young couple in material support and blocked, figuratively speaking, the channels through which Alexander successfully conducted business. Their opinion did not change even the fact that the family had 2 children, Mark and Tony, older and younger, with a difference of 3 years. And then this marriage began to crumble. Selina didn't get what she hoped for and started abusing alcohol. She often behaved inappropriately. For example, once snapped and took the children, left without telling her husband where. And where she left, got drunk once again, ended up in the clinic, and the children for a while were in the orphanage, where they were treated terribly. But Alexander forgave his wife and believed that his love will help her to heal. It did not work. Drunk once again, Selina got into an accident. Alexander was left a widower with 2 sons, Tony and Mark, and for their well-being, he had no choice but to return home to Sicily. The upbringing of the boys was taken up by the whole of the large family they had never known. And then it turned out that the morals and characters of the brothers became increasingly divided. Mark grew up a quick, noisy guy. They said that he is all in his great-grandfather. But Tony, They said he was too much like his father, and worse, too much like his mother. But in general, it seemed that life went on and even over time entered the normal course. The brothers grew up, graduated from school, and entered prestigious universities. And moreover, the family did not give them a special choice. Very eloquent was the example of Alexander. So the brothers, as it was decided at the family council, went to study in the UK. And then it turned out that they were very different. Mark was in favor of continuing the family business. He was used to live primarily focused on the interests of his family. But Tony, he was in the clouds. He wanted to go into the plant business. His grandfather literally spat at him once, saying that they had gardeners and they were servants, and that his father's example should show and prove to the boy what idiotic dreams lead to. The relationship between the brothers was getting cooler and cooler, but still Tony mostly listened to what Mark told him. And at some point, it began to seem that things were even getting better. Tony even had an affair with a girl from that. Figuratively speaking, the circle, which approved the Bianco family, was the daughter of one of the old business partner. "So he has a fiancée," Maria said in a colorless voice, and took her eyes off Mark, staring out the window outside the cafe as a torrent of wet snow and rain poured down from the sky. Tony is a very trusting guy. Mark's voice took on an unexpected seriousness. He's had affairs, but each time, unfortunately, it's been with a woman after the family fortune. But at first, everything seemed to be fine. Then we had already chosen a girl for him. "Interesting," stretched Catherine, and grinned to all appearances. She did not penetrate any particularly sad mood from this conversation, and generally kept wary like a wildcat in ambush. "No, it's really very interesting that in the 21st century for a man to choose a girl for his family. Some kind of savagery. Forgive me my vernacular. And how was it? Bride festivities like for a king?" "I think we just live in different worlds," Mark replied wryly, "so we can't understand each other. No, there was no viewing, and it doesn't matter how they met. But yes, Tony got a decent girl. Angelica Gray, her father's from the US, and he's one of our main business partners. Unfortunately, things got a little difficult in his business, and we decided to. Anyway, it seemed like a union that would be convenient for everyone, and wildness. That's it. Period." Catherine folded her arms on her chest. She was staring at Mark and did not react to the fact that Maria was shoving her under the table with her foot. "Nothing will change my mind." "And what happened next?" Maria asked hastily. "The whole backstory is fascinating, but I don't understand. How did Tony end up here?" Mark shook his head and continued his story. "At some point, it was decided that Tony had enough of being a theorist and needed to become a practitioner. In other words, he was assigned to manage some of the family affairs. Angelica was to help him with this, especially as it was planned that after the marriage there would be a merger of one of the companies owned by the Bianco family with one of the almost bankrupt firms of her father. However, suddenly Mark began to notice that his brother always walks gloomy. He asked what was wrong, but Tony kept silent, only sometimes suddenly, as if he could not stand it, and broke down and began to talk about how tired of it all, how tired he is tired that everyone around them tell you what to do. Sometimes these quarrels between the brothers became quite fierce, especially recently. For example, once Tony said that he wanted to donate €500,000 for the preservation of forests in South America, and said that he had the right to do so because, thanks to his work, in fact, the family receives a significant part of the profit, so this amount can be considered his bonus. But of course, he was not allowed such liberty. And then suddenly one day Tony just disappeared. Just one day everyone wondered why he didn't come down to the common dining room for breakfast. Tony wasn't in his room. He just left a note saying he had something very important to sort out that would make a big difference to their family name. He didn't tell anyone about his plans. Naturally, they came looking for him. His family and Angelica too. Tony's father suggested that maybe the guy decided to visit the town where his ancestors, great-grandparents, were from. Tony had once had such an idea. Then Mark contacted a very respectable private detective and tried to make inquiries. And he suddenly reported that yes, Tony really came to the city and had an affair with a regular girl, a nurse from a communal apartment. But we'd only known each other a couple of days. Maria marveled. Suppose he was being followed. But where would an affair come from? I don't know. Mark rubbed the bridge of his nose and sighed tiredly. I'm confused myself, it seems. I was given the wrong information in the first place. Hummed thoughtfully Catherine and frowned. And what happened next? Mark continued his story. It turned out that after the news came, Tony's fiancée immediately went to the city. It so happened that Angelica could fly out instantly, and Mark was delayed for a couple of days' business issues. And no sooner had Mark rejoiced that his brother was found, but immediately Angelica reported the terrible news that when Tony had already boarded a private plane, which was to return, them to Italy, he suddenly fell and lost consciousness, hitting his head, from which he fell into a coma. It happened almost 6 months ago. At first, doctors said that the chances are small, but recently began to give hope that Tony may wake up, and that there is even a possibility that he will recover, although of course being in a coma for so long is very dangerous. Mark added that at first he thought that his brother had just gone mad temporarily, that he had had, so to speak, a belated youthful rebellion, but suddenly he was just curious. And who was this girl with whom he was having an affair? He just wanted to know in general terms what the story was. And here was the news: the girl was pregnant. Mark confessed that he had been furious at first, thinking that Maria was going to give birth to a child and blackmail Tony to marry her, or at least take her on a generous allowance. However, now he was no longer sure of that at all. But the most shocking thing for him were her words that Tony, it turned out, was here without memory. Because the private detective hired by Mark presented everything in a completely different light, say. The guy just came to town, living the high life, going out and having a strange affair. Really strange, said Catherine. It was not like that. You know, it seems that your private detective... I agree with you, nodded Mark. It's just crazy, you know, during the day. I mean, my people have been gathering some information. The owner of this detective agency has fled. I mean, he's gone, and then he's gone, and there's no contact with him. I feel like he's deliberately deceived me. But I don't understand why. I thought he was a serious person. But today I turned to another detective right after meeting you. Mark looked at Maria. Actually, I didn't expect results so soon. But he told me something. He said that something strange happened at the airport where my brother flew to then, running away from our family. He was met by some people. He went somewhere with them. You know, I think I'm beginning to understand something, Catherine said, wrinkling her nose as she always did when she was in deep thought. Amnesia? Theoretically, it could have been induced on purpose. What? Mark blinked in confusion. Unfortunately, there are such ways, Catherine sighed. Maybe someone needed your brother, forgot something, that he was lost. I mean, you just do not think that I read too many tabloid detectives. I do not read such things. Speaking, Catherine gesticulated vigorously with her hands. But you said that your brother was going to deal with something important. And then suddenly he disappeared and lost his memory. It does not seem suspicious. Mark was about to answer, but was interrupted by the phone ringing. Apologizing, he reached for his smartphone. He took the call, and then his face changed. Is he awake? Are you sure he's okay? No, I can't right now. Mark ended the call and looked at Maria carefully. Tony has regained consciousness. The doctors say it's unbelievable. But he came to his senses, and his body readings are such that it's hard to believe. He woke up and he really doesn't remember who he is, but he remembered you. He asks about you. But Maria took a deep, convulsive breath. Oh, she had been told by the doctor who had observed her pregnancy that it was impossible to worry. Now came the feeling that everything inside had twisted, shrunk into a lump from anxiety, and then blossomed a strange feeling as if an outlandish flower had opened, which mixed anxiety, fear of finding out the truth about what had happened then, why Tony hadn't said a word to her goodbye, and some hope. Mark's phone rang again. The man rounded his eyes. Wait a minute. It's not from the clinic now, but it's also very important. I'll leave for a minute, okay? He said, getting up from the table. How are you? Ekaterina asked me sympathetically. Pale, you some kind of... No, Maria shook her head stubbornly. I want to understand what's going on here. Did you understand anything? Only that Tony had a fiancée, and it seems that she intercepted him when you left the guy for a minute without supervision. Catherine waved her hands. Well, and then he fell into a coma, and now here again is fine. And it's all very exciting, but he comes out unfree man. So you're sorry, but not our flight bird friend. The whole family, see what? It's like a medieval royal court, man. Even if this Tony guy did something, I think the most you can expect is alimony. Otherwise, Maria, don't get involved with such people. Maybe they are even there in Italy like a mafia family, but the alimony decent is a topic. Maria was about to answer her friend that not everything is so simple, and that she cannot, does not want, and will not be so easy to leave aside, until she will not deal with everything finally. But then Mark returned, whereas his expression had been shocked and pleased after the first call. Now it was more like annoyed and worried and tense. I have to go home, Mark said, but you have to come with me. What? Maria and Catherine both shouted at the same time. Are you crazy? Catherine twisted her finger at her temple. Why? No, I understand everything, but still do not understand anything. Here's what, honey. Sharply forward, Mark almost faced Catherine. He covered her hand with his paw and lowered his voice. I know I acted this way the first time I met your friend. It's hard to apologize, but you better. Stop pouncing, Kitty. You just piss me off. Ha! Catherine retorted, her cheeks instantly flaring. She added meaningfully and pulled her hand out as if Mark was burning. Okay, I'll try not to claw your eyes out. For the next 5 minutes at least. Deal, nodded Mark before returning his full attention back to Marie and explaining his thought. It turned out that Mark had heard everything that Maria had told him and had started to assume something. And now that he had confirmation of her words about Tony having amnesia, he could share it all with her. Mark didn't understand why she might want to, but he had no doubt that Angelica had hidden the details of the condition she'd found Tony in for some reason. Or to put it another way, she hadn't seen fit to tell anyone that the boy had lost his memory, and that had led him to some other thoughts. But the main element that fundamentally changed the whole present situation was that he had just received a phone call from a reliable person who had stayed in Italy to manage all of Mark's affairs. And this man found out something interesting. The thing was that Angelica's father had a lot of debts to dangerous people, simply put, to the mafia. And Tony's fiancée, as it suddenly turned out, was not so white and fluffy and already being with Tony together. She, it turns out, was having an affair with Nacho, the son of an industrialist. Moreover, it turned out that Angelica had begged Tony, even demanded that he withdraw large sums of money from his family's accounts, ostensibly to cover her father's debts. In fact, the money was intended for herself and her lover. And now, having learned all this, Mark had no doubt about several things. Firstly, that he must quickly shield Tony from any influence of Angelica, who came to the clinic every day. Secondly, he intended to talk to his brother and try to unearth, for a start, at least bits of truth about what had preceded his escape. And thirdly, he was now convinced that Maria must be protected. She and her child could not remain as they were. But I can't. Maria was indignant. You're suggesting that I should snap and just go to Italy and... What then? Tony, the girl thought she was going to faint. It turned out that's how it was. Tony remembered her. He wanted to see her, and she wanted the same. But he doesn't know I'm pregnant, Maria said. No, but I'll tell him, said Mark. Of course, you'll have to wait a bit. You don't have a passport, do you? No, answered for her friend Catherine. And how did you guess? And in general, she has a credit hanging. Prohibit travel with debt. What? She turned to Mary, who again eloquently kicked under the table. I'm telling it like it is. I'll take care of all material matters, Mark said seriously. And of course, you need to move your apartment, I'll rent a place. A good one. And I'll pay for your observation at the best clinic in town. I'll take care of my nephew or niece. For the first time, a genuine and warm smile appeared on Mark's face. And as soon as the passport is ready... Maria, you need to think seriously, said Catherine. I agree, replied Maria hastily. Not because of everything you promised, but I just agree. And yes, Tony, I care about him. And what I said before, I just thought that he'd left me. But now, what you said changed everything. And even though right now she had overstepped her own pride, Maria still felt and knew she was making such a choice not only for her own sake, but much more for the sake of the child. 'Cause she really hadn't been feeling well lately. It would be good to have a rest, and not to live being pregnant in conditions when the neighbors were making drunkenness and scandals. And as for everything else unclear in this situation, that Maria suddenly with confidence thought she will solve problems as they come. But right now she should accept everything as it is and a little go with the flow. And it is also very important, just here is vital to believe in the best. Still talked about all the details of the upcoming. Catherine strongly insisted that she will not leave her friend and will look after her. And literally the very next day Maria was able to move. Mark rented for her a cozy apartment with everything you need in an elite residential complex. And then, having undergone an examination in a private clinic, Maria also talked to her bosses about the fact that, although there was still time before her maternity, she was going to take a sick leave from work. For the next few weeks, Maria's life went a bit like a dream. She did a lot of things, but she did almost nothing, and it seemed to her that all her thoughts were occupied with only one Tony. And if not him, then she thought about her baby, how her life would change again when he was born. Sometimes she was afraid that what if this family, Tony Bianco and his relatives, suddenly need her child? What if they wanted to take it away? After all, she is just a humble single mom, while they are surely immensely powerful, but giving in to fear for a short time. Maria, however, immediately forbade herself to think of such bad things, and convinced herself that everything will be fine. She would have been quite difficult if it were not for Catherine's friend, though, and spun busy squirrel in the wheel, but found time to then in the clinic to accompany her, or just visit and entertain some conversation. And then, somehow, unexpectedly came the time when the hands of Maria was a passport, and Mark again flew to accompany her. And he brought with him some doctor who introduced himself as Alexander, a very qualified specialist, owner of a network of reproductive health clinics in Europe. In general, Mark assured the girl that this doctor was the best, and he would take care of her. Marie would be calmer if her old Dr. Elizabeth was with her instead of this American with cold ice. Blue eyes and such a polite smile that she seemed to be glued to him. But what could she do? Be sure to call me every day. Her best friend hugged her tightly as they stood at the airport. Don't get lost, added Catherine with a strained smile, tears shining in her eyes. I won't get lost, Maria replied, and then boarded the private jet. Naturally, here you could admire the luxury of the interior with furniture upholstered in cream leather, bouquets of live orchids, the fact that they serve black caviar in gold jars and tropical fruits. But thoughts and feelings, all of Maria's experiences, were now given to something else. She was grateful to Mark for the fact that he did not interfere with any personal conversations and let her immerse herself in herself. And there was something to think about, at least about the few brief and strange conversations she'd had with Tony in recent weeks. Tony called her. She didn't call him. She was a sick person. She didn't want to disturb him at the wrong time. Tony said that he missed her terribly and that he had so much to tell her, but in person. And Mark told him that Maria was expecting a baby. And Tony said that it was the best thing that could happen to him. And again he added that they would have to talk. No, Maria had no illusions that the guy was in love with her, and now they would get married and become a happy family. She quite allowed the possibility that he would be, well, as a kind of weekend dad, and the marriage will conclude as desired by his relatives with some suitable to his status person. News about Angelica, by the way, Mark did not report. More precisely, he said that while Maria certainly do not need to worry about it, it is not her concern, and it was incomprehensible because, in fact, this person had a very direct relation to her. But the girl decided that, in principle, soon she herself will clarify everything personally. Flight seemed endless, but it was over. After all, it turned out that the private plane had a mini-room with a very comfortable bed. And when Maria woke up, she was offered a relaxing herbal tea. And Dr. Rain also offered to give her a special massage of her lower back so that it would not hurt. But she refused. It was not enough. And then it was finally possible to get off the plane. The car drove along the winding mountain road from where a dizzyingly gorgeous view of the sea opened up. The private clinic where Tony was looked more like a mansion from some movie which stands surrounded by a picturesque garden. Maria's heart was beating fast when she entered the clinic. Mark led her under his arm, but fell behind by a step when she finally entered the room. Tony. The girl couldn't hold back an emotional cry when she saw the one she had to admit she felt something beautiful and deep for. Maria. He held out his arms to her, but he was sitting on the bed. They say I'll start walking in another 6 months, Tony smiled. Something in my spine is badly damaged. I can stand up, but they forbid it until the operation. Maria, it's okay. It's okay. Their fingers intertwined. She stood beside him, and it seemed to her that the whole world was filled with a special light and warmth from the fact that they were now touching palm to palm to palm. Thank you, Mark, Tony said to his brother, who had finally entered the room. Maria, you must be tired. We'll do it later. No. The girl shook her head resolutely, and then resolutely lowered herself into the chair standing by the patient's bedside. I have too many questions, and I even guess what they are. Tony nodded and smiled, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. Then, well, it's probably even right in a way. Talk about everything now, unless you're really tired from the road. I just want to finally understand, to make sense of what's going on, Maria exclaimed. Brother Tony stood with his hands folded on his chest and looked thoughtfully at the couple. He knew that it was possible, necessary, and time to talk about a lot of things. I wanted to tell you this myself personally, Tony gently squeezed the girl's fingers. I started to remember, and he spoke. It turned out that then he left home not just because he quarreled with his relatives, the reason was really serious. Tony became aware that Angelica was cheating him, that she wanted to get his money, but her plans were not far off. She wanted to persuade him to empty the family's accounts, promising that they would start a new life together. She really wanted it, but not with Tony by her side, but with that guy named Nato. But Tony didn't care much about that. He guessed about his fiancée's infidelity. He was preoccupied with another problem. It turned out that his grandfather had made serious mistakes in managing his finances, that his own managers wanted to frame him. Tony was gathering evidence of this. He knew that when he revealed the truth to his grandfather, there would be big changes in the family, in their business. And before making all this mess, Tony decided to go to the town where his ancestors once lived. He wanted to touch his family's history. But he didn't know he was being followed. At the airport, he was met by people. They were sent by a man named Gabriel Mancini, a big man in the head office of the Bianco family business. He told his men to scare the guy. Tony thought that it was just worried about him. Friends from Italy followed him. He knew these people, and therefore fearlessly accepted their offer to accompany him on the trip. And then something went wrong, apparently. They began to put too much pressure on Tony, insinuating how he is wrong. They had a conflict, and the guy hit his head for the first time. And those people, realizing that because of them, the heir to such a family name got amnesia, left him to his fate and decided to hide from the theoretical revenge of the Bianco family in Mexico. Angelica was really looking for her fiancé. She hoped to convince Tony that it is a great option to grab the family money, split it in half, and run away to the end of the world, no longer feeling dependent on relative. And then she learned that her fiancé lost his memory. Angelica decided that it was very convenient. She wanted to return with Tony to Italy, and there, after keeping him for a few days in her mansion, to convince him that they were in love, and that his relatives were evil schemers who did not allow them to be together. Angelique hoped that under her influence he would continue to carry out the original plan, that is, to withdraw money for her. That's why Angelica talked to a private detective and paid him extra to give Mark incomplete and incorrect information about her brother. But everything didn't go according to plan. Tony said that he had to stay in the city for an important case when there were about 5 minutes left before the plane left. He ran down the ramp, stumbled, hit his head. Apparently, one injury layered on top of another. At first he did not fall into a coma, but was very sleepy and complained that his head was spinning. Angelica, of course, hurriedly flew away. She needed Tony. She did not want to hear about the fact that he has here. You see what a girlfriend stayed. Angelica skillfully wove her network. They love each other. And then, already on the plane, many kilometers above ground, Tony became quite bad and he lost his senses. And while he was in a coma, Angelica, of course, had no opportunity to do anything. And then he came to himself. The doctors were amazed at how quickly recovered not only the body, but also the mind. When Mark returned to his brother, he asked him what to do with this Angelica, who turned out to be such a traitor. Tony said that they had already explained themselves and that he forgives his ex-fiancée. After all, Angelica originally had to enter their family not by goodwill, but because she was pressured by her father. He was actually ready to sell his daughter if he could pay off his debts. So Tony asked his brother, since Mark had much more money than he did, to help Angelica, as they call it, to get out of this big family game. Angelica left Italy with Nacho. They went somewhere to the east, to Japan. But then, it seems, parted. Tony also shared with his brother everything that he had learned about the betrayal of his grandfather's manager. And since Tony was temporarily very weak, Mark did everything to make the head of the family know the truth, to save his family's capital. That's how the main problems of the last time, which occupied the brothers and now, were solved. "I have something very important to tell you," Tony said. Mark left the room, which, by the way, was more like a room in a luxury hotel, and Maria and Tony were left alone. "Oh, wait," smiled the girl. "You told me so much. Just my head is spinning. Like a movie retold. No, really. I can't even believe it." "It doesn't matter anymore," Tony said. "I want us to talk about us." "About us?" Maria asked excitedly, and her heart started beating fast. "I think now would be a good time for that." Tony smiled. And then, in a few moments, he had a velvet box in his hands, and in it was a ring with a sparkling diamond. "I wish I could propose romantically," Tony said, "but I can't help it. Maria. Will you be my wife? The girl looked at him amazed, disbelieving, stunned. It was something much more than the most daring dream come to life. It was something that changed her world, simply turned the whole universe around her for Maria. To marry Tony, the guy that fate had accidentally brought her together with, and with whom she would have a child very soon. Yes, she said. Tony's hands trembled a little, but he managed to put the ring on her finger. Oh, but what about? Maria's cheeks flooded with color. But your family... I don't care, Tony said. Even if I have to fight with all of them for the rest of my life, I won't give up on you. But I won't have to. You know, it's strange. But it seems that after what happened to me, they treat me differently. It's strange, isn't it? Not at all, Maria smiled. They just realized how close they were to losing you. Maybe that's what helped them see how wrong they were. My grandmother and everyone else wants to meet you. Ouch. Maria covered her mouth with the palm of her hand. Not right now, Tony reassured her, but soon. And then, as soon as I can, at least stand firm without swaying. We'll have a wedding, the most beautiful one, the one you've always dreamed of. I've never dreamed of having my own wedding, Maria confessed. Then it's time to start. You'll have time for everything. And now, can I kiss you? Maria said yes. In due time, the child was born a boy, who decided to call Victor Cesare Bianco. And trying on a wedding dress, Maria rejoiced how quickly she managed to get in shape after childbirth. It was a gorgeous wedding. In Maria's opinion, even too lavish and crowded. But otherwise, it was impossible, of course. But spinning in the new society where she was now to live was a little easier because the wedding flew friends, Catherine and John. Catherine, by the way, as a little seemed to Marie, something like a romance with Mark. He was, of course, a man of complex character, but it seemed to Marie that they are very suitable for each other. Naturally, it was now impossible to think of working as a nurse. Tony generally said that his wife could never work, but Maria timidly said that she had always dreamed of being a doctor, and he said that, of course, he did not mind that she would get such a profession in some better university. And Maria also did not forget her old acquaintances, and taking advantage of the great opportunities opened up to her, helped to improve the lives of Michael, Diana, and a neighbor along with her pet dogs.